It's the spring of 1813, and somewhere in the English countryside a man who hasn't spoken a single word in 10 years has just picked up a pen. In Regency England, an unmarried woman cannot accept a handwritten note from a gentleman without his explicit permission, and doing so is read by all of polite society as the beginning of a courtship. The Duke of Linwood hasn't said a word in a decade. But the morning Henrietta Wendwood arrives at his estate, he writes her a note, and she writes back. What passes between them in the months that follow changes everything. Through ink and paper and carefully chosen words, through shared rooms and quiet evenings that neither of them could quite explain. Tonight, we begin before all of it. We begin, as most things begin, with a ruin. You don't need to have done anything wrong. That's the first thing to understand about reputation in Regency England. You don't need to have lied, or cheated, or hurt anyone at all. You simply need someone to say, in the right room, with the right expression on their face, that you did. That is enough. In this world, that has always been enough. Reputation here isn't a social nicety. It isn't the warm feeling of being well liked at a dinner party. For a family of the genteel middle classes, not aristocracy, not working poor, but the careful and precarious in between, reputation is the only currency that truly matters. It determines who will receive you and who will employ you. It shapes who will marry your daughters. It follows you to the draper's shop on the high street and influences whether or not he extends your family credit. It is woven into every practical corner of daily life, and it is, as more than one observer of this period noted, almost perfectly brittle. A single accusation can shatter it. Not a conviction, not even a trial, just an accusation. Consider the specific mechanics of that. In 1813, England has no organised police force. That institution is still 16 years from existing. What the country has instead is a private system of prosecution. The burden of pursuing justice falls almost entirely on the accuser. If someone decides to charge you with theft, they hire private agents, known as thief-takers, to build the case against you. They bring it before a magistrate at their own expense. And the accused? The accused must then fund their own defence against a private party who has already committed fully to the idea of your guilt. If you are wealthy, you stand a reasonable chance. If you are not, you are very nearly finished before the trial even begins. And there is something else to understand about the charge of theft specifically in this era. Under English law at the time, stealing property above a certain value was technically a capital offence. Juries frequently avoided the death sentence by deliberately undervaluing the stolen goods in their verdict. But the shadow of that possibility never quite left the charge. A man accused of theft was not accused of a minor indiscretion. He was accused of something that, in the wrong courtroom, on the wrong day, with the wrong jury, could cost you your life. Henrietta Wendwood's father was not wealthy. He was a solicitor, respectable, careful, trusted by his clients for 31 years. He kept meticulous records. His daughter had watched him practice that hand at the same desk, by the same window, for as long as she could remember. The candle always moved a little to the left. The quill always rested at the same angle when he paused to think. He had a small library of legal volumes he was quietly proud of, a daughter who read them with genuine interest, who asked questions he sometimes found difficult to answer without checking his books. He was, by every measure you'd recognise, a good man. And in the autumn of 1802 he was publicly accused of stealing a sum of money from the estate of a recently deceased client. The accusation was false. Henrietta knew this with the particular certainty that comes not from evidence, but from knowing a person's character across an entire childhood. But knowing and proving are two very different things in any era. In Regency England, they are separated by something closer to an ocean. The trial lasted 2 days. Her father was convicted. He died in prison 6 months later. Let the room settle for a moment. Let it go a little quieter. Hello, lovely people. Welcome back. I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. Before we begin, a small ritual. I read every comment, usually long after most of you have drifted off. So tell me where you are, and what time it is where you're listening from. And if stories like this one help you rest, a subscribe means more than you'd think. Now, you need to understand what happens next, not to him, but to her. Scandal in Regency England doesn't stay with the person it started with. It moves outward, through every connection and every family member who shares the name. A woman's place in this world depends almost entirely on the reputation of the men in her life, her father, her brothers, her husband. When her father's name appears in the scandal columns and the caricature prints appear in the windows of the print shops, and they do appear, quickly and without mercy, Henrietta doesn't simply lose her father. She loses her social position, her credit, her marriage prospects, and her place in the world, almost simultaneously, within weeks. You should understand what these caricature prints actually were, because they did more damage than the court verdict in many cases. They were sold for a penny apiece at shops on the high street. They were clever, and they were cruel, and they were widely read by people who would never have been allowed inside a courtroom. A man accused in a caricature print was not simply accused, he was ridiculed, his features exaggerated into something grotesque, his alleged crime depicted with gleeful specificity. And anyone who bought that print and laughed at it, including perhaps someone you knew, came away with a vivid, lasting image that no letter of denial could entirely erase. Information in this world travels faster than most people now appreciate. An accusation read at breakfast is a conversation topic by noon. By dinner it has become something approaching a verdict. Henrietta finds that doors she has walked through her entire life begin to close. Doors you might not even recognize as doors until they're shut. Not rudely, that is the particular cruelty of it. Very politely. With expressions of regret offered in lowered eyes on the street, and invitations that simply stop arriving without explanation. By the winter of 1802, she is what the period would call entirely without prospects. What does that mean in practical terms? For a woman of gentle birth and moderate education, with no independent income and no male relative of standing to provide for her, there are approximately 3 options. The first is a position as governess, considered the only respectable employment available to a woman of her class, which tells you a great deal about the narrowness of respectable options. The most secure of them pays roughly £30 a year. It offers no security of tenure and no pension once the children grow up and no longer need educating. A governess occupies an uncomfortable position in any household. She's too educated and too well born to associate freely with the servants below stairs. She's too employed and too financially dependent to be treated as a guest above them. She belongs nowhere in the house. She's tolerated by all of it with the careful, practiced politeness people reserve for situations nobody quite knows how to address. The second option is to become a dependent relative. You attach yourself to a married cousin or a generous sibling. You contribute your presence as unpaid company and assistance in whatever form the household finds useful. This arrangement is known in drawing rooms as being a poor relation, which is a wonderfully diplomatic phrase when you consider it, for what amounts to a fairly uncomfortable situation for everyone in the house. The poor relation eats at the table when there are no more important guests to fill the seats. She sleeps in the room nobody else particularly wanted. She understands, without anyone needing to say so, precisely what her position cost her, and precisely what it costs the family that keeps her. The third option, the one no one in your drawing room ever discusses, is the workhouse. Henrietta spends the decade following her father's death, navigating the first two options with whatever resources she has. She works as a governess for two families, the kind of work you take when there's nothing else and you need it to look respectable. The first position ends when the eldest daughter marries and the role evaporates, as these roles always do, the moment your usefulness ends. The second ends in circumstances she has firmly decided never to revisit. By December of 1812 she is 31 years old, and she has £12, a trunk of her father's books, and a letter she did not expect. The letter comes from the estate of the Duke of Linwood, written in a formal hand that belongs, as she will discover later, to his land steward. It informs her that His Grace is aware of her circumstances and wishes to offer her a position as companion to his housekeeper, Mrs. Alcott, who is elderly and increasingly in need of some assistance. The financial terms are generous: room, board, and a wage set slightly above what a governess of her experience might ordinarily expect. There is a single line added near the bottom, in a hand marginally different from the rest. If you picture the steward pausing before writing it, uncertain whether to include it, you'll understand something about the household she's about to enter. Miss Wendwood should be advised that the household operates, for the most part, in considerable quiet. His Grace does not receive callers and prefers his own company. She reads the letter twice, then a third time. She has heard of the Duke of Linwood. Everyone in the county has heard of the Duke of Linwood. He is one of fewer than 30 dukes in all of England, a fact worth pausing on, because a duke is not simply a wealthy man. He occupies one of the rarest titles in existence, a rank that sits just below royalty, one that carries enough social weight that his word, spoken in the right room, could alter your family's standing overnight, restore it, even. And this particular duke has, by every account anyone in the county can verify, not spoken a single word in 10 years, not to his servants, not in church, not at dinner, not to anyone you can name. She packs her trunk. She writes her acceptance in a careful, unhurried hand. Her father's hand she notices only afterwards. If you're wondering why she goes at all, the answer is that she doesn't have another option she can live with. She seals the letter with plain wax because she has no family crest left to press into it. And in the first days of January 1813, she sets out for Linwood Hall. She is not, she tells herself, expecting anything remarkable. She expects quiet. She has been living with quiet for 10 years. She can manage quiet very well. What she's not expecting is the note waiting on her breakfast tray the very next morning, or what writing back to it will set in motion. She spends the journey to Linwood thinking, not about the Duke, but about the county's stories of him. You have to understand the particular quality of these stories, because they are not the sharp, specific gossip that circulates in town about a real scandal. They're softer than that, more uncertain. They're the kind of stories that grow in the absence of information, which is to say that they've grown very large indeed. Some people say a woman died, a fiancé he loved, taken by fever before the wedding, and the grief of it stopped his voice. Others say a duel, that he spoke the order to fire, and something happened afterwards, something nobody saw clearly, and he simply never spoke again. There are people in the county who'll tell you it's a performance, an eccentricity of the very wealthy, and that behind closed doors at Linwood he talks perfectly normally to his valet. There are others who say his physician was summoned twice in the first year, and that the physician left both times looking troubled. None of these stories agree with each other. None of them have a source you could actually trace. None of them have a name at the end of them. What Henrietta notices, and what you might notice too watching from that hired carriage as the countryside becomes more remote, is that all of these stories share one feature. In every version, the Duke did something once that he has never done again. In every version, there was a moment before and a moment after, and he chose, or was forced, to live entirely in the after. She understands something about that, more than she would prefer to. The carriage arrives at Linwood Hall at 3:30 on a grey January afternoon. Your first impression, boots on frozen gravel, breath making small clouds in the cold, is simply of scale. The house is larger than you expected. Most houses that have been described to you as large turn out, on arrival, to be merely substantial. Linwood Hall is genuinely, disorienting large. It sits at the end of an avenue of bare winter oaks, and its stone face catches the last of the afternoon light in a way that makes it look older than it probably is. There are 3 floors of tall windows, there is a portico, there is, rather alarmingly, a clock tower, and it is entirely, profoundly quiet. No dogs, no stable yard noise, no sound of activity from the kitchen garden. The gravel crunches under your boots, and the crunch sounds very loud, and then it doesn't anymore, and the silence comes back. A footman appears at the door before you've finished walking toward it. He is very correct and very composed, and he takes your bag with the practiced neutrality of a man who has learned not to let his expression say anything at all. He leads you inside through a hall with black and white marble floors that your steps echo on with an intimacy you find immediately uncomfortable, and then up a staircase, and then along a corridor, to a room that turns out to be warm and reasonably well furnished and, you notice this specifically, and you will think about it later, has a small writing desk positioned near the window, with paper already laid out, and an inkwell, and a quill resting at an angle that suggests someone put it there on purpose. The housekeeper, Mrs. Alcott, comes to find Henrietta before dinner. She's a small woman of perhaps 70, with a careful manner and sharp eyes behind her spectacles, and she says very little except to explain the arrangements of the household, meal times, which parts of the house Henrietta has access to, which parts she does not, and the general rhythms of the day. She mentions the Duke once, briefly, the way you'd mention a feature of the landscape that simply has to be navigated around. His Grace, she says, is sometimes in the library in the evenings. He doesn't mind a presence there, provided it's quiet. Henrietta says she understands. She goes down to dinner alone, served in a small room off the main dining hall, not the dining hall itself, which she quietly appreciates. And she eats, and she thinks, and she goes to bed in the warm room with the writing desk. If you've ever lain awake in an unfamiliar house learning its rhythms through the dark, you'll understand something of what this first night is like. A great house speaks to you differently at night than it does in daylight. Old timber settles, wind moves against tall windows, the distant, very occasional sound of footsteps somewhere on the floor above, regular measured footsteps, crossing from one end of a room to another and back again. Someone who can't sleep, walking. She falls asleep before she decides what to make of that. The tray arrives the next morning at 8. Tea, toast, and a small folded note, sealed with red wax pressed with a simple letter L. No elaborate crest. Left beside the teacup as matter-of-factly as if notes from dukes were a standard feature of breakfast trays throughout England. Which, to be clear, they are not. She opens it after she has poured her tea. There are 11 words written in a precise economical hand that she will come to know very well. Miss Wendwood, I hope your rooms are comfortable. The library is open to you. She stares at the note for rather longer than 11 words strictly require. Here is what she knows, sitting there with her tea going cold and the January light coming grey through the window. She knows that in Regency England a gentleman does not write to an unmarried woman without her explicit permission. She knows that her accepting this note, by not sending it back, by not requesting through Mrs. Alcott that such communications cease, is, by the standards of her world, equivalent to granting that permission. She knows that the act of replying would cross a line that her world has drawn with considerable firmness and considerable historical precedent. She puts down her tea, she goes to the writing desk, she takes the quill, it's a good one, recently trimmed, and she writes back, Your Grace, the rooms are very comfortable. I am grateful for the use of the library. She folds it. She doesn't have wax, so she borrows a piece of bread from her tray and uses the warmth of her hand to seal the fold, which is not exactly regulation but will have to serve. She asks the housemaid who comes to collect the breakfast things to please give it to His Grace. The housemaid takes it without a flicker of expression. Then she looks at Henrietta for just one moment, very briefly, and if you were watching, you'd have caught something flicker across her face before the composure came back. Not quite a smile. Something in that direction. She goes to the library that morning, if you could see it through her eyes. Floor-to-ceiling shelves of dark leather spines, a fireplace already lit and warm by the time she arrives, 2 reading chairs drawn close to the hearth, and a writing desk positioned by the long window, overlooking what must be a formal garden under its present covering of frost. The desk is the one that matters, because on it there is a pen, a fresh inkwell, and a stack of good writing paper, and the pen has clearly been used recently. The ink is still not entirely dry on the nib. The Duke of Linwood is not in the library when she arrives, but someone was not long before, and if you were the kind of person who notices things, and Henrietta Wendwood is exactly that kind of person, you'd notice the ink. She picks a book from the shelves, Cowper's poems, which she has always liked, and sits in the chair by the fire. She reads until noon. No one disturbs her. The fire crackles and settles and crackles again. Once she hears footsteps in the corridor outside, that same measured, deliberate pace from the night before, and they slow, briefly, as they pass the library door. If you were standing in that corridor, you'd feel it too, that slight hesitation, and then continue on. She turns a page. The fire settles. She'll admit only to herself that she is listening. She meets him the following afternoon. Not by arrangement. There's no arrangement to be made in a house where one party doesn't speak and the other doesn't yet know the rules. She simply goes to the library at 2 o'clock because the library has been offered, and because it's warm, and because she has been alone in her room since breakfast, and is running out of ways to occupy herself without feeling the edges of her situation too clearly. He is already there. He's standing at the far end of the room, with his back partly to the door, examining something on one of the upper shelves. If you were Henrietta, your first impression would be a tall man, somewhere in his mid-30s, in the kind of clothes that are well made and entirely uninterested in announcing the fact. He doesn't startle when she enters. He doesn't turn immediately. He finishes whatever he was doing with the book in his hand, replaces it, or adjusts it, with the careful deliberateness of someone who has arranged his shelves precisely and expects them to stay that way. And then he turns. He looks at her. She looks at him. It's the kind of moment you feel more than observe. He inclines his head, a formal, unhurried nod that acknowledges her presence without requiring anything in return. Then he moves to the writing desk by the window, sits and picks up his pen. That is the entire encounter. She finds a chair by the fire. She opens her book. She reads, or rather she sits with her book open and performs reading, while being entirely aware of the sound of a pen moving cross paper 20 feet away. You know the particular quality of that sound, perhaps. Ink on good paper. It is quieter than you'd expect. She can hear it clearly. They stay in the same room for 2 hours. He writes, she reads. The fire does what fires do. And at 4 o'clock he rises, inclines his head, the same measured acknowledgement, exactly as you'd expect from a man who has replaced words with gesture, and leaves. She sits for a moment after he's gone. Then she goes back to actually reading her book, because there is nothing else to do, and because the alternative is spending the rest of the afternoon examining what has just happened in more detail than it strictly warrants. But she notices, as she does so, that the stack of writing paper on the desk is slightly smaller than it was this morning. Before we go further into what this particular household felt like from the inside, it helps to understand what a great house actually was in Regency England, because the image most people carry of it is wrong in a specific and interesting way. You might picture something serene, orderly, perhaps little austere. The reality is closer to a small, highly stratified village that has been somehow installed inside a building. A ducal estate of any size employed dozens of people, and those people were organized into a hierarchy as rigid and codified as anything in the society outside its walls. If you'd walked into Linwood Hall as a visitor, you'd have encountered this hierarchy within the first 30 seconds, in who opened the door, who spoke to you, and who did not. At the top of the domestic order, the butler controlled the male staff and the cellars and the silver. The housekeeper, Mrs. Alcott in this case, controlled the female staff, the household accounts, and the keys to everything that mattered. Below them were the lady's maid, the cook, the footman, the housemaids, the kitchen maids, the scullery maids, the laundry maids, the coachman, the grooms, and a collection of other positions that varied depending on the size and ambition of the household. Every one of these positions had a defined rank relative to the others, one that, if you occupied it, you understood exactly. And that rank was observed at the servants' table with the same seriousness that their employers observed precedence at the dining table above stairs. Henrietta Wendwood fits into none of this. She is not family, so she cannot eat at the family table, though in Linwood Hall this is less of a deprivation than it might seem, since the only family member is the Duke, and he largely eats alone. She's not a servant, so she cannot eat below stairs either, not with any comfort on either side. She occupies the peculiar social no-man's land of the employed gentlewoman, a category the Regency household has not entirely figured out how to accommodate gracefully, and one that would make your position, if you were her, genuinely difficult to explain to anyone who asked. She eats in the small morning room. She comes and goes through the side door. She's treated with impeccable politeness by everyone in the house, and with the careful, measuring attention of people trying to work out exactly what she is. Mrs. Alcott is kind to her in a way that is specific to people who have learned to be kind at measured distance. The footmen are correct. The housemaids are curious but circumspect. And below stairs she comes to understand, and what she learns would surprise you, not through any single conversation, but through the accumulated texture of many very careful silences, that the household of Linwood Hall has developed an extraordinary collective competence at managing a life without words. You couldn't build that competence in a day. It takes years. It takes trust. Because here is something worth knowing about how the Duke ran his estate. He ran it entirely in writing. His land steward communicated with him through a leather-bound correspondence book that was left on the library desk each morning and returned each evening filled with his written responses. His solicitor in London received regular, meticulously detailed letters. His bankers, his tenants, his suppliers, the local magistrate when estate business required it, all of them communicated with the Duke of Linwood through the post, through his steward, through the extraordinary volume of written correspondence that left Linwood Hall each week and arrived from it in return. A man who cannot speak, it turns out, can still manage your affairs in his estate, provided he has a good steward, a reliable postal service, and a very great deal of patience with ink. Which brings us perhaps to the question of why. You might assume, because most people do, that the county has correct information about this. It doesn't. What the county has is what we've already established. Competing stories, none of them with a verifiable source, all of them sharing the structural feature of a before and an after. A moment that changed something. What Henrietta notices in the first weeks at Linwood is that the household itself doesn't speak about it either. Not from ignorance. She's certain of that. From something more like loyalty, or perhaps something more like tact. It helps to know something about the Regency world's relationship with solitude and withdrawal, because it isn't quite what you'd expect. The era had a genuine, documented fascination with the figure of the recluse, and not entirely an alarmed one. Wealthy English landowners of the period sometimes built ornamental hermitages in their estate grounds, small stone follies, deliberately rustic, tucked into scenic corners of the garden. And some of them, this is true, and it's worth sitting with for a moment, actually hired people to live in them. Real human beings, paid a wage, sometimes required by the terms of their employment to speak to no one for a period of years, to grow their hair and beard without cutting, and to embody the idea of solitude as a kind of landscape feature. Visitors to the estate would come and observe the hermit at respectful distance, the way you might observe a particularly interesting piece of statuary. This was considered, by the Regency aristocracy, a perfectly reasonable use of another person. The genuine recluse, a nobleman who withdrew from society out of something real, something internal, was viewed very differently. Not as a decorative feature, but as a problem, an eccentricity that might shade into something more serious if not carefully managed. The Duke of Linwood, by choosing to withdraw into something authentic rather than ornamental, had done the one thing his class found genuinely difficult to accommodate. He had opted out, not of a dinner party, not of a season, but of the entire performance of being a duke in public, of speaking and being spoken to, and occupying the centre of a room the way your rank required. He still ran the estate. He still managed his obligations through his steward. He still attended to everything that could be attended to in writing. But he had drawn a wall around himself, and the wall was made of silence, and no one, in 10 years, had worked out how to climb it. You begin to understand this about him alongside Henrietta in pieces, in the quiet hours of the library. She's there every afternoon now. It doesn't happen by discussion or agreement. Neither of them discusses or agrees to anything, but it becomes a pattern, the way patterns form when two people occupy the same space long enough, and find, to their mutual surprise, that they don't particularly object. He writes at his desk. She reads in her chair. Occasionally he moves to a different shelf, or she shifts closer to the window when the light is better. Once he adds a log to the fire without being asked. The kind of small, quiet gesture you'd almost miss if you weren't paying attention. The way someone might do something for themselves that happens to benefit another person in the room. She thanks him. He inclines his head. That is the extent of their spoken exchange for the first 3 weeks. And yet, and this is the thing that will take her some time to name correctly, though you might name it faster, she is not lonely. She has been lonely in the decade before Linwood, with a frequency and a depth you'd recognise if you've spent time truly alone. But in the library, in the afternoons with the fire and the shelves and the sound of a pen moving across paper, she's not lonely at all. She isn't sure what that means. She isn't yet sure it means anything in particular. She goes back to her chair. She opens her book. Outside the window, the frost on the formal garden has begun, very slightly to thaw. By the end of January, Henrietta has been at Linwood Hall for 4 weeks. The garden is showing itself, a little more each day, the shape of its paths, the geometry of its hedges, the outline of something that was clearly designed by someone who cared very much about order and proportion. She looks at it from the library window and thinks that it tells you something. She isn't yet sure what. Below stairs, you discover, if you're navigating the careful corridor between family and servant the way Henrietta does, that the topic of the Duke's silence is managed the way all impossible household subjects are managed, not by discussion, by the architecture of what's never said. The footmen don't mention it, the housemaids don't mention it. Mrs. Alcott, who would know more than anyone, has made her decision about what she will and will not speak of. The decision appears to be final. What Henrietta pieces together comes not from words but from pauses, from the specific quality of silence that falls when she asks even adjacent questions. She asks once whether the Duke has always preferred the library. The question lands and sinks in the particular way you come to recognise, without echo, without response. His Grace values his privacy, says the footman attending her fire, and returns his attention to the grate. She asks Mrs. Alcott a week later whether the Duke ever receives family. Mrs. Alcott considers this for a moment, in the way people consider questions they've decided not to answer, and says that his parents have been deceased for some years, and that there is a cousin in Devon who writes occasionally, and that the letters are answered. Then she changes the subject with the smooth efficiency of someone who has changed many subjects in exactly this way. The household knows. You can sense it in the particular quality of the silences they construct around the subject. They simply aren't telling. She has stopped finding the silence strange. She notices this one morning without expectation. She has stopped finding it strange, and she has stopped bracing for it to end. It is simply what the house is. And she is, it turns out, someone who can live in a house that is simply what it is. By February, the frost is gone. The garden has revealed itself entirely. The first pale thing, you'd call it a snowdrop, though it might be something earlier, something she doesn't know the name of, appears in the bed nearest the window. She is in the library when she notices it. So is he. He's writing. He doesn't look up. But something in the angle of his head suggests he's heard her small sound of surprise. She doesn't say anything. Neither does he. The thing goes on blooming. And so, without discussion, without arrangement, without anyone intending it, something in the house has shifted. Silence in Regency England is not what it sounds like to you now. You carry a different set of associations with silence, quietness as absence, or as awkwardness, or as the thing that falls between people who have run out of things to say. The Regency world understood it differently. Silence was a register of meaning in itself, its own grammar, its own obligations, its own social weight. Take mourning, for instance. England in the 1810s had highly codified rituals for grief, an elaborate language of dress and behaviour and withdrawal that everyone understood and everyone observed. A widow in full mourning wore black for 12 months, muted colours for another year after that. She withdrew from society, refused invitations, declined to attend balls and assemblies. A man in mourning for a parent observed similar restrictions for at least 6 months. These withdrawals weren't simply private, they were publicly legible, a statement in a language everyone around you could read. Silence, in other words, was never neutral. In this world, a man who withdrew from public life was not simply absent. He was saying something. The question was what? The Duke of Linwood had been withdrawn for 10 years. He was in full mourning for nothing anyone could identify. No wife, no parent whose death coincided with the silence, no public grief that anyone could attach a date to. He had, by all appearances, simply withdrawn for reasons of his own, and the reasons had never been offered, and nobody, it seemed, had worked out how to ask. What you need to understand about this era is that there was no medical vocabulary available to explain what he might be experiencing. The concept of trauma as we now understand it, the idea of an identifiable psychological injury with recognizable symptoms and possible treatments, didn't exist in 1813. The word would wait until the late 19th century, and the clinical framework would wait longer. What existed in its place were vaguer terms: nervous disorder, melancholia, lowness of spirits, that described symptoms without explaining them, and recommended cures that mostly addressed the body while ignoring everything else. The word aphasia, meaning the loss of ability to speak, wasn't coined until 1861. Aphasia voluntaria, meaning voluntary or elective mutism, came later still. In 1813, if you watched a man stop speaking, the explanations available to you were limited and mostly wrong. He was mad, perhaps, or eccentric, which was the polite word for the same thing in someone with enough money. Or he was performing, for reasons of his own that only he understood. The Duke of Linwood had no name for what was happening to him, and neither did anyone around him. He had simply been walking around for 10 years inside an experience that his world had no word for, which is, if you sit with that, a genuinely remarkable kind of loneliness. Henrietta sits with it. She has the advantage, perhaps, of knowing what it means to carry an experience your world has no language for. The experience of being a ruined woman who didn't do anything wrong. The experience of watching a father die for a crime he didn't commit. The experience of knowing something that couldn't be proven in a world that only trusted proof. She understands something about living inside the unspeakable, more than she said to anyone. By March, she has started reading aloud in the evenings. She doesn't plan it. It's a habit she had as a child. Reading aloud was simply how she'd always read, the words needing to be said as well as seen, and she'd abandoned it somewhere in the governess years because it hadn't seemed appropriate in other people's houses. She starts again one evening in March, quietly enough that you'd hardly notice it beginning, and then at a normal speaking pace when no one objects. She reads Cowper, then Scott, then a book of natural history she's found on the third shelf. She doesn't address the room. She doesn't address him. She simply reads, the way she's always read, with the particular ease of someone doing something they've done all their lives. He doesn't look up from his writing, but the scratch of his pen slows just slightly when she begins, and then continues. It's the only way you'd know he was listening. There is something happening in this house that has no category in the etiquette books of the period, which is itself a strange and notable fact. The Regency world had etiquette books for nearly everything. There were rules for calling cards, for the correct timing of morning calls, for how long you were permitted to stay, for the proper form of address for everyone from a baronet's younger son to a bishop's wife. If a social situation existed, someone had written instructions for navigating it. No one had written instructions for this. An unmarried woman living in a duke's household, reading aloud to him in the evenings. By the standards of the world outside, you'd look at this and know exactly what to call it. The name is courtship. By the standards of their world, they are conducting a social relationship that implies, at minimum, a degree of mutual interest that would be entirely legible to anyone who walked in. And yet the form of it defies every social script available. He cannot ask her permission, as a gentleman should, because he cannot ask anything. She cannot respond to overtures she doesn't have a language to receive. They are doing something their world doesn't have a category for, and they are doing it with the quiet, determined focus of two people who have decided independently that the category can take care of itself. It is, if you think about it, the most defiant thing either of them has done. Outside, the garden continues its slow return to life. The snowdrop is joined by others. Pale green begins to appear at the edges of things. The quill on the library desk is worn down by April and replaced with a new one, and the new one is already wearing down. She reads. He writes. The fire settles. The window fills with the kind of grey English afternoon light that, if you look up from your book at the right moment, makes the inside of any warm room feel like the whole world. And one morning she arrives in the library to find, on the chair beside her usual one, a pressed flower. Small, pale, the first one from the garden. No note, just the flower. She picks it up. She holds it for a moment in both hands. Then she sets it down carefully on the writing desk. His desk, the one she has never sat at before, with the correspondence book and the good inkwell and the quill resting at its particular angle. And she sits down, and she takes the quill, and she writes him a note. It takes her longer than it should. She writes, then crosses out, writes again. What do you say to someone who left you a flower without saying anything at all? In the end, she settles on 7 words. Thank you for this. It is very beautiful. She's aware this is not great literature. She folds it anyway and leaves it on the desk and goes back to her chair. He comes in at the usual time. He sees the note. He reads it, standing up, without sitting down, with the particular economy of someone who has learned to manage every transaction efficiently. Then he folds it, puts it in his waistcoat pocket, sits, and picks up his pen. He writes for an hour. She is not watching. The next morning there is a note on her breakfast tray. You're welcome. The flower is called a Galanthus nivalis, or snowdrop, which you probably knew. She reads this 3 times, the last 4 words in particular. Which you probably knew. It is, she realizes, a joke. A small, dry, entirely unexpected joke from a man who has not spoken a word in your presence, or anyone's presence, in 10 years. She puts the note in her pocket. She goes to the library. She takes out paper and writes back. Something has shifted. Not dramatically, not suddenly. But the flower is on her windowsill now in its small glass, and there is a note in her pocket, and the library has begun to feel, without her quite being able to explain it, like a place where something is happening. She writes back to the Snowdrop note. She keeps it brief. She tells him she did know the name but not the Latin. She tells him the snowdrop looks well in the glass. She asks, and here she pauses, because asking him anything requires a kind of courage she's still calibrating, and if you asked her why she chose this particular question, she isn't sure she could say whether the garden always starts this early. He writes back the following morning. She finds the note on the library desk when she arrives. He writes that the snowdrops are always early, that there is a bed of them under the old elm at the east side of the garden that has been appearing in January every year for as long as he's been at Linwood, which is all of his life. He writes that he suspects it has been appearing for considerably longer than that, and will continue to do so without assistance or acknowledgement from him. He writes, and if you read this quickly you'll miss it, that the persistence of snowdrops is one of the more quietly encouraging things he knows. She sits with this note for rather a while. Then she writes back that she finds this encouraging too, that she has, for the past several years, been in the habit of noticing things that persist without requiring anything in return. The note is longer than she intends. She folds it before she can change her mind. He reads it. She knows because, and you've learned to read this too if you've been paying attention, the handwriting in his response shifts slightly. Not much, just a fraction, in the way handwriting shifts when the person holding the pen has changed their weight or taken a breath. He writes that he has read her note twice and would like to ask a question. The question is whether she reads in her room in the evenings, or does she prefer the library? She writes back that the library is fine, but only if it's not an imposition. He writes back, no, not an imposition. The opposite. You can hear the restraint in that. The opposite. 2 words carrying rather a lot. She doesn't quite know what to do with this. She sits with it for the rest of the afternoon. The library is warm, the late January light making everything amber. She picks up her book. She reads. Actually reads, this time, the better part of 3 chapters. And that is how, without discussion, without arrangement, without a single word spoken aloud, the evenings begin too. The evenings in the library are different from the afternoons. In the afternoons there is the feel of something established, a routine, a rhythm, a thing they've both settled into. The evenings are something else. The evenings are a choice made again each day that neither of them mentions but both of them make. In the evenings he often reads rather than writes. She finds this unexpected. You might too if your picture of him was someone who never stops working. But no. He reads. He has a chair on the far side of the fireplace from hers that is clearly his, worn in the particular way of furniture used by the same person in the same way for a long time, and he reads with the absorbed stillness of someone who reads often and well. She tries not to watch. She reads her own book. They are 2 people in a warm room reading. It is not remarkable. She's not entirely sure why it feels remarkable. One evening in February she loses her place. It happens, in rooms that are this full more than you'd think. She's been on the same 3 paragraphs for 20 minutes, reading without landing. She puts the book face down in her lap and looks at the fire. He looks up. She is looking at the fire. He looks at her. The room is very quiet. You'd hold still too if you were in it. Then he picks up the pen. He has a notebook beside his chair in the evenings, separate from the desk correspondence, and writes something. He holds it toward her. She gets up. She takes the note. Is the book bad? She reads this. She looks at him. He's watching her with the direct economical attention she's beginning to recognize as his entire conversational register. She goes back to her chair. She takes her own notepad. She's brought it with her, she realizes, for several evenings running, without consciously deciding to. And she writes, "The book is excellent. I keep stopping to think." He writes back, "About what?" She writes, "Whether things always feel this odd when they're happening." A long pause. He writes, "They do. That's how you know they're happening." She holds this note for a long time. She puts it with the others, in the drawer. This is how the evenings go. Back and forth. Occasionally, not frequently. You would need to have been there to understand the quality of it, sitting in that room, with the fire and the books and the particular texture of attention that fills a space when two people are both pretending not to pay close attention to each other and failing. The notes are the punctuation. The conversation is everything between them. And if you've been in a room like that, a room that is full without being loud, you know exactly what it means. By the time February ends, she has stopped thinking about her situation as something to be managed and started thinking about it as something she is, in fact, in. She is in a library. She is in a house. She's in a correspondence that has no name and no clear arc, and that she is navigating by instinct, which is not how she has ever navigated anything before, and which she finds, cautiously, provisionally, that she minds less than expected. Outside, the snowdrop is still in its glass. It does not require her to do anything except occasionally change the water. She changes the water, and in the morning there is a note beside her breakfast tray that has nothing to do with the snowdrop, and everything to do with what the snowdrop means. You need to understand what letter writing meant in this period, because it carried a weight that is difficult to fully convey now. In Regency England, the written word was not a shortcut. It was a declaration. The way you wrote a letter revealed your character, your education, your emotional state, and your intentions, with a precision that spoken conversation often obscured. Spoken words are governed by real-time social pressure. You can be caught off guard, you can say something imprecise, you can be misheard. Written words are chosen, and the choice itself is visible. There were manuals on the subject, because letter writing was understood to be a social skill as important as dancing or playing the pianoforte, and considerably more revealing than either. The physical act of writing was deliberately slower than speech. You prepared your paper, trimmed your quill, considered each word. When someone took the time to write to you carefully, you understood that they had decided to spend that time on you, that the words in front of you had been selected, that the selection meant something. Between men and women, this weight was multiplied. If you received a letter from a gentleman in this world, you understood immediately what it implied. A degree of deliberate communication that was socially legible in ways that spoken words in a public room were not. A spoken word could be forgotten or disputed. A written word remained. It could be shown. It was evidence. The Duke of Linwood writes to Henrietta Wendwood every morning on a folded note left beside her breakfast tray. She writes back the same day, usually in the library on paper she's begun bringing from her room. The household delivers them without comment. The notes are evidence of something. No one says what. And yet the household, if you watch it carefully, has begun to move around the correspondence with the particular tact of people who have decided not to notice something that actually they notice very well. In the beginning, what they write is almost nothing of consequence, which is, if you think about it, exactly the right place to start. He tells her there is a history of the natural world on the third shelf, second from the left, that she might like. She writes back that she has found it, and that the chapter on migratory birds is particularly good. He writes that the chapter on migratory birds is the only good one, and that the author's understanding of botany is frankly embarrassing. She writes that she had noticed the botany problem, and had assumed it was only her. He writes that it was not only her. This exchange takes 3 days and 4 notes. By the standards of what their world allows them, it is an almost reckless degree of intimacy. But their world standards, you may have gathered, are not the only ones operating at Linwood Hall. He writes about the estate. A particular field on the northern edge of the property floods every spring, has flooded every spring for 40 years, and he has been attempting to address it through a series of arrangements with the local drainage board. He writes about the drainage board with the contained exasperation of someone who has dealt with them for a long time and developed a very specific kind of patience, the kind you'd recognize if you've ever dealt with a body that has no particular incentive to solve your problem, the kind that isn't patience at all, but is simply what remains when all other options are exhausted. She writes back about a client she once worked for, the father of the first family she governed for, who had the same arrangement with a different board in a different county, and the same result and the same expression. She doesn't know why she tells him this. She tells him anyway, because you tell things to people who make it feel safe to tell them. He writes back that he would very much like to hear about the expression. And there it is, the thing she hadn't expected. Not warmth, exactly. She would have been careful around warmth, would have measured it and watched it for signs of what it expected in return, but curiosity. A duke who has not spoken in 10 years is curious about the expression on the face of a country solicitor she worked for 15 years ago. And the curiosity is, somehow, more moving than warmth would have been, because it is harder to perform. You can perform warmth. You can decide to seem warm for the duration of a note and then put down the pen. You cannot really perform curiosity. It asks follow-up questions, and he does. And if you've been paying close attention, you'll notice that this is the moment the dynamic in the library shifts for the second time. In March, the notes begin to change, and if you were to read them side by side, January's and March's, the difference would be immediate. Not in subject, they still discuss books, and the garden's slow spring progress, and the occasional estate matter that Henrietta asks about out of genuine interest, and that he answers with the particular thoroughness of someone unused to being asked. The change is in tone. Specifically, they begin to say true things. True thing. The note that starts it is unremarkable in appearance. The kind of note, if you came across it in isolation, you'd read quickly and put down. He writes, on a Tuesday morning, that he's been working through a legal question about the eastern boundary of the estate that has occupied him for 3 weeks, and that he has finally found the clause in the original conveyance deed that resolves it. He writes this with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has found something that was always there and simply required patience to locate. He adds, almost as an afterthought, that the patience required was considerable, and that he is not certain he applied it correctly in the first 2 of the 3 weeks. She reads this. She sits with it for a moment. Then she writes back, "I would have given up in week 2. I respect that you didn't." He writes back, and if you picture the pace of this, you'll understand it correctly. A morning passes between each note. Each response composed at a writing desk and delivered at a fixed time. I very nearly did give up in week 2. That's different from not giving up. She reads this. She reads it again. It is a small thing. It is the kind of small thing that is difficult to explain as significant without sounding as though you've projected significance onto nothing. But she knows, in the particular way you know things before you have evidence for them, that she has just seen something true. That the difference between very nearly giving up and actually giving up is what he's decided is worth saying, and that he's decided to say it to her. She writes back, "Yes, but you're the one who ended up with the answer." He writes, after a pause she can measure by the relative freshness of the ink. This is a generous way to put it. She writes back, "It's the accurate one." The next morning, on her breakfast tray alongside the regular note, there is a small sprig of something green from the garden. Too early for flowers, but the first living thing from outside that isn't the snowdrop which is still in its glass, still persisting. She puts the new sprig in a glass of its own. She writes to ask what it is. He writes back with the Latin name, the common name, and one sentence about where it grows, and when it will bloom, and what colour it will be when it does. She writes, "I'm building quite a vocabulary." He writes, "You already had one. You're building a garden." She puts this note with the others. You'd do the same. The fire is almost out by the time she gets to it. She notes this as a fact. She does not examine what it means. By April, the vocabulary is growing in both directions, which you might expect if you've been following how these things work. She discovers that he has opinions about more subjects than she had assumed. More than the estate and the law and the natural history of the garden. He has opinions about political economy, set out in careful, hedged sentences that suggest someone who has thought carefully rather than someone who has stopped thinking. He has opinions about the reform of the prison system, offered tentatively, as though he's aware they might surprise her. They do, a little. Not because the opinions are wrong, they are not wrong. If you were to look at them plainly, they are better reasoned than most, but because they are the opinions of someone paying close attention to a world he is not currently participating in. She writes back about the prison system. She writes more than she intends to, and if you've been following her carefully, you'll understand why. She writes from the specific knowledge of someone who lost a family member to a system built to punish rather than correct, and who has had 12 years to think about the difference. Her note is 3 pages. She folds it carefully. She puts it on his desk. She goes to her chair, opens her book, and tries not to think about what she's just done. You'd probably do the same, he writes back the following morning. He writes with a care she feels in the pace of the handwriting, steadier than usual, more deliberate. He says he's read her note twice. He says that what she has described, the specific texture of a wrongful outcome, is something he thinks about more than she might expect, and that the reason he thinks about it more than she might expect is something he would like if she permits it to discuss further. She writes, "You may." He writes back, "Not yet. When I am ready to say it in the right way, I am asking you to wait." If you've ever been asked to wait by someone who explained themselves that clearly, not yet, but please wait, you know the particular weight of it, the particular quality of trust it asks for. She keeps the note with the others. She waits. She understands, and you might too at this point without being told that this is the thing he's been working toward. The thing underneath all the notes about botany and boundary clauses and migratory birds. There is something in the centre of the library's silence that she hasn't yet been given the name for. You might have a name for it, from where you're standing. She doesn't. Not yet. She is patient. She has had 12 years of practice, and patience, if you've had to develop it the hard way, doesn't feel like a virtue. It feels like a muscle you built by lifting something heavy for a very long time. Outside, the April garden is making its fullest argument. If you looked at it now, if you could stand at the library window in April 1813, you'd see the argument clearly. The snowdrop is long gone. Its glass is empty on the windowsill. The new spring growth has replaced it on her desk. 2 more sprigs from the garden, each labelled in that precise hand, each one a word in a vocabulary she's actively building, noting the names, noting the dates, noting which drawer she keeps them in when they've dried. She's building a garden, he said, and if you look at what she keeps, the labelled sprigs, the careful notes on the dates, the names in both Latin and English, you'll see she took him seriously. She is. By June, she has a small collection of his notes in the drawer of her writing desk. She has not decided yet what she means by keeping them. They're simply there, folded in a stack in the order they arrived. You'd recognise the shape of it. 14 notes, 15, 20. Each one in that precise economical hand, each one saying something that, taken individually, would seem modest. Taken together, they form something else, a portrait of a person, assembled piece by piece, the way a portrait is painted from many separate sessions, none of which looks like a face on its own. His notes tell her things about him that, in January, she would have said were none of her business. That he reads late and widely, that the estate was managed badly in his father's time, and that he has spent 20 years correcting that inheritance, and that he is nearly finished. And that nearly finished is a strange place to find yourself if you aren't sure what you'll think about once the work is done. That particular note she reads twice. There is something in it she needs to sit with. The phrase, nearly finished, and the question underneath it, the question of what comes next, the question you ask when the life you built for practical reasons has delivered everything it promised, and you're not sure it's the life you wanted. She writes back about knowing things to a level of precision that feels both complete and incomplete, about finishing a book and not being sure what to do with the feeling that it leaves behind, about her father's library, the legal volumes he was proud of, the hand he practiced at the same window, the quill resting at the same angle. She writes that she has not thought about the quill angle in years, and that she isn't sure why she's thought about it now. She puts the note on the library desk. She goes back to her chair. She picks up her book and holds it without reading it. Outside, the summer has arrived properly. The garden is at the height of what it can do. The formal beds are full and ordered, and, in the early mornings, before the day begins in earnest, smell of something you'd recognise the moment you stepped outside, green and warm and unmistakably alive. She finds, one morning, a second pressed flower on her chair. This one she knows the name of. She knows because he has written it on the back of the paper wrapper he pressed it in. A careful label, as though she were an exhibit in a collection, as though he were cataloguing something that might otherwise be difficult to find again. The name of the flower is Primula vulgaris, common primrose. Underneath the name, in the same precise hand, is a word she hasn't seen in any of his notes before. It is simply yours. She sits down in her chair. You'd give her that moment if you were watching. She holds the paper for rather a long time, then she gets up. She goes to the writing desk. She takes the quill, his quill, the new one, which by now has the particular wear that comes from a great deal of use, and she writes. She's been thinking about what to write for 3 months, she realises, without knowing she was doing it. The thought arrives fully formed. She writes it down. It takes 4 lines. She folds the paper. She leaves it on the desk. She picks up her book and reads. Actually reads this time, the whole afternoon. He reads the note. She knows because the pen stops for considerably longer than it usually does. Then it continues, and so does she, and so. The summer passes the way important summers do, in increments you'd only recognise if you were paying close attention. The morning light in the library shifts angle, slowly through August and into September. The garden moves from the exuberance of high summer towards something more contained, the particular beauty of a garden beginning to think about winter. The quill on the desk is replaced, and then again. The notes are now longer, not by arrangement, not by anything you could point to as a decision, but the notes that began as 7 words, as 11 words, are now half a page, sometimes a full page, sometimes more. His handwriting, that precise economical hand, has begun to move slightly faster, as though the words come more readily now, as though writing to her has stopped being a decision and become something closer to a habit, the most sustaining kind. There is one evening in June when she writes him a note and then sits with it for 20 minutes before sending it. Not because what she's written is wrong, because it's true, and she can feel the difference. You know the feeling, probably. She sends it. She writes back at length. She writes things she hasn't written to anyone, things she hasn't spoken of in years, if she spoke of them at all. About her father, about the trial, not the facts of it, which you'd recognise if you've heard a story told too many times, worn smooth with repetition, but the texture of it, the specific things that don't wear smooth, the smell of the courtroom, sawdust and something close underneath it, the quality of silence in the gallery when the verdict was read, the walk home afterward, through streets that felt the same and were not. He writes back carefully. He doesn't say what you might expect him to say. He doesn't say that he's sorry for her loss, the standard phrase deployed at standard distance. He says, the walk home afterward must have been the hardest part. It usually is. The distance between a verdict and your own door is longer than it looks on a map. She reads this note standing up in the library with her coat still on from the morning walk. Then she sits down. She takes out paper. She writes, "You have had an occasion to learn this." It is not a question. She isn't sure if she means it as one. She folds the note, leaves it on the desk, goes to her chair and opens her book and does not read a single word. He doesn't write back until the following morning. When he does, it is 4 words on a small card. Some time ago. Yes. She holds this card for a long time, then she puts it in the drawer with all the others. By October, Henrietta has developed a specific and uncomfortable theory. She doesn't invite it. It arrives the way unwelcome understandings always arrive, not suddenly but accumulated, until one morning you discover you've known something for weeks and simply not allowed yourself to know it fully. The note that starts it is unremarkable on its surface. He's writing about a legal matter, a tenant dispute, a boundary question, the routine business of running an estate. He mentions, in passing, a solicitor he once trusted with estate matters, who he found had been helping himself to money that wasn't his. He mentions that the discovery was made in the autumn of 1802, or possibly early 1803. He no longer remembers precisely. He mentions that the matter was handled, that he regrets it was handled the way it was, that the handling was, in retrospect, a mistake that cost something he has not been able to calculate correctly since. She reads the note. She reads it again. She reads it a 3rd time. You need to understand something about how the private prosecution system worked in this period, specifically about witnesses. A private prosecution in Regency England was brought by the accuser, assembled by the accuser's thief-takers, and argued by the accuser's lawyers. The accused funded their own defence against whatever case had been built. What could change that outcome, what occasionally did change it, was a witness willing to come forward with information the prosecution hadn't anticipated. A witness with direct knowledge of what actually happened. A witness who chose not to come forward was not legally culpable. There was no obligation to testify on behalf of someone else's case. But the choice had consequences, and those consequences were real. There are not many solicitors you'll find publicly accused of stealing from estates in the autumn of 1802. There is, in her knowledge, only one. His name was Wendwood. He was her father. And this note, which mentions 1802, and a solicitor, and a discovery, and a handling, and a regret, and a cost that cannot be calculated. This note is the closest thing to a confession she has ever received from anyone about anything that has to do with her father, She puts the note down, she picks it up. She reads the word regrets again, and if you've ever read a word knowing exactly why someone chose it, you understand why this one costs her something, and handled, and cost something. A man as precise with language as this one, a man who has written carefully for 10 years because words are the only medium he has, does not choose these words by accident. He does not write regrets when he means unfortunate. He writes regrets because he means regrets, and you don't write that word unless you intend to be understood. He knows who she is. He has known since before she arrived. He was there, or near there, or connected to what happened in a way he cannot say directly, and cannot entirely hide. And he has just, very deliberately told her so, obliquely, in the way someone who cannot say a thing directly says it as near to directly as they can manage. She doesn't write back that day, or the next. The note sits on the desk. The pen stays where she left it. She goes to dinner. She goes to bed. She lies in the dark and listens to the footsteps above, that measured, deliberate pace you've come to know as well as she has, falling asleep to it for 10 months. She's not, she notices, angry at the sound. She doesn't know what to make of that, she thinks. What is the nature of what she feels? It's a question worth sitting with alongside her if you're willing. She should be angry. She knows this clearly. If what she suspects is true, if this man, this reclusive, precise, considered man who's been writing her notes about Greek and drainage boards and pressed primroses, if he knew something about her father's trial and chose not to speak, then what he is responsible for is not small. It is her father's conviction, her father's imprisonment, her father's death in a cell 6 months later. It is 10 years of her own life spent in the wreckage of everything that followed. She should be angry. She is angry. And she is also, and this is the part that takes 3 days of sleepless evenings to understand, not finished with him, not finished with any of it. Because here is what she also knows, what you might know too, if you've been listening closely enough. The note is a confession. A man who had done something unforgivable and felt nothing about it would not write that note. A man for whom the past was simply past would not have spent 10 years in silence. The silence itself, the thing that brought her here, the thing she was hired to be adjacent to, the thing she has been living inside for the better part of a year. The silence is not eccentricity. She sees it clearly now. The silence is the shape grief takes in a person who's decided they have no right to speak. He stopped speaking because he failed to speak when it mattered. You have to hold that for a moment. And that, the particular, precise, terrible logic of it is something she understands better than she wishes she did. She has spent 10 years being careful with words too, being precise, saying nothing she wasn't certain of, to no one who hadn't earned it, building a life out of the minimum viable expression of things. They are more alike than she has been willing to name. It is a terrible and complicated feeling to discover that the person most responsible for your deepest wound is also the person who has, without either of you intending it, helped you begin to heal. She lies in the dark. She listens to the footsteps. They are slower tonight, she thinks. Or perhaps she is only listening differently. In the morning she goes to the library. She sits down at the writing desk. She takes a piece of paper. She thinks for a long time. Then she writes, "I think I know what happened. I think you know that I know. I am not leaving. That is all I am going to say today." She folds the note. She leaves it on the desk. She goes to her chair. She opens her book. He arrives at the usual time. He reads the note standing up, the way he always reads notes. She's looking at her book. She's not reading her book. She can feel the exact moment he finishes reading. The room changes, very slightly, the way rooms do when something important has just happened in them. He goes to the writing desk. He sits. He picks up the pen. The scratch of it moving across paper is the only sound in the room. It is the most familiar sound she knows, and if you were watching from the doorway you'd think nothing has changed. You'd be wrong. Outside, the October light is thin and pale and horizontal through the tall windows. The garden has gone quiet. The last flowers have been cut. The beds are cleared and raked and waiting. She turns a page. He writes. The room holds them both. The next morning, there is nothing on her breakfast tray, no note, no card, nothing at all. She goes to the library at the usual time. He's at the desk. He rises when she enters. She's never seen him rise before, and crosses the room with something in his hand. He gives it to her without stopping, without quite meeting her eyes. It is not a note. It is a letter, sealed with red wax pressed with the L. Several pages. She can feel the weight of them. She takes it. She goes to her chair. She reads. You need to know what is in the letter. Not all of it. Some of it belongs only to them. But the substance of it. In the autumn of 1802, a man named Carstone brought a private prosecution against Henrietta's father on a charge of theft. Carstone was a man of the kind you've probably encountered in some form. Modest wealth, considerable debt, and a very strong need for someone else to be at fault. He had inherited from a distant relation and miscounted what remained. He needed the shortfall to be someone else's fault. Henrietta's father, meticulous, careful, 30 years of clean accounts behind him, was a convenient answer to where the money had gone. The charge was false. The Duke of Linwood knew this at the time. He was 23 years old, and Carstone was a cousin, a distant one, but present enough in his life to carry a certain pressure. The Duke had seen the actual accounts. He had seen the original figures before Carstone's version replaced them. He knew the truth. He knew it with the same clarity you get when the numbers in front of you simply do not add up the way someone is insisting they do. And he said nothing at the trial, because Carstone had made clear, in private, in the way people with power make things clear without saying them aloud, that speaking would be expensive. He was 23. He was newly inherited. He was not yet certain of the weight his own name could carry, or whether it would be enough against an established accusation by an established accuser. He calculated wrongly that it would not. You can see that clearly from here, from the distance of 200 years. He could not see it from 23. He was afraid. in the specific way you're afraid when you have power you haven't learned to trust yet. And so he said nothing. And the verdict came in on a Tuesday afternoon. You know the weight a Tuesday can carry after this, and Henrietta's father was convicted, and the Duke of Linwood went home. He does not call it a cowardice in the letter. He doesn't call it a choice. He says only that he persuaded himself at 23 that he had no good option, and that he has never in the years since found a version of that reasoning that holds. You've probably met this kind of reasoning before, the kind that made sense once and stopped making sense slowly, over years. Henrietta's father died in prison in April of 1803, 6 months after the verdict. The Duke stopped speaking in May of that year. A month later, a Tuesday again, though he does not know if that is significant or simply how memory arranges things to make them legible. He was 24. He sat at the library desk and the words were gone, and when he looked for an argument for getting them back, he found he didn't have one, and so they stayed gone. He tells her all of this, directly, without softening it, which is, you understand, the hardest possible way to tell it, and also the only way it means anything. She reads each line as though she is reading a document she will later have to recite from memory, and perhaps she is. Each word costs her something. She pays it. When you have waited 12 years to understand something, the understanding when it comes is not a relief, it is a reckoning. But here is the rest of what he tells her. The part, if you're still reading, she did not anticipate. He did not spend 10 years doing nothing. In the months following the death of her father, following his own silence, the Duke of Linwood began to work, quietly, methodically, through the correspondence that had not stopped when his voice did. He tracked the actual movement of Carstone's money through a network of estate accounts and tenancy records that Carstone had not been careful enough to cover entirely. He found the original ledgers, the ones that showed what had really happened to the missing funds. He identified 2 witnesses who had been present in 1802 and had at the time said nothing, for reasons of their own, but who could, with the right approach, be persuaded to speak now. He spent 7 years locating them, 3 years after that persuading them. What you'd call that most likely is penance. Meticulous, quiet, decade-long penance. He is, as of this October, ready. He has enough, not almost enough, enough. He is writing this letter now because she had the right to know first, before any solicitor is summoned, before any hearing is arranged, before he does what he is going to do, whatever mechanism is available to a man who has not spoken publicly in 10 years, and undoes what he did not prevent. He tells her one more thing near the end, 4 lines. I brought you here because I owed your family something I was not yet able to repay. I kept you here in the months since, for reasons that have very little to do with the debt. She reads to the end of the letter. She puts it down. The October light has moved entirely across the floor by the time she looks up. He is at the desk. He has not written a single word since he gave her the letter. The pen is not in his hand. He's simply sitting and waiting, in the particular way of someone who has run out of things to do except to accept whatever comes next. She looks at him, directly, across the room. He looks back. He doesn't look away. And if you've been paying attention to how carefully they've both been avoiding exactly this, you understand what it means. She gets up. She goes to the desk. She picks up the pen. She writes 4 words on a piece of paper and sets it in front of him. When do we begin? No question mark. It is not a question. He reads it. He picks up the pen. He writes one word underneath hers: tomorrow. She puts the paper in her pocket alongside all the other notes. She goes back to her chair. She opens her book. This time she reads a great deal more than you might expect. The winter of 1813 is a quiet one at Linwood Hall. Quieter than usual, if such a thing is possible. The correspondence that leaves the estate increases. The steward makes several trips to London that are not mentioned to anyone specifically. A solicitor arrives in January and leaves after 2 days, and his face when he leaves is the particular professional expression that lawyers wear when they are confident about something, but not yet authorized to say so. Henrietta writes. The Duke writes. They are in the library every afternoon. The fire settles, the quill moves. Outside, the garden is grey and still, and waiting for spring in the patient way of gardens that have waited before. In March, a date is set, and if you want to know the moment things became real, in a different way than any of the letters or the plans, it is this one. A date written in ink on a solicitor's calendar is a different thing from an intention. It has a shape you can see. It is the 14th of April, 1814, 7 weeks away. The hearing of the county magistrates is scheduled for the 14th of April, 1814. It is to be held in the same building where, in 1802, a wrong verdict was delivered, which is, if you know the law at all, a deliberate and meaningful choice. This is not coincidental. The Duke's solicitor is a man who understands that where something happens carries its own kind of weight. In the week before the hearing, the household of Linwood Hall is, for the first time in a decade, not quiet. There are visitors, not social visitors, not the calling card kind, but the purposeful, brief kind, who arrive with documents and leave without them. The footmen carry things between rooms. Mrs. Alcott moves through the house with an expression that suggests she's been waiting for this particular week for quite some time. Henrietta asks her one evening how long she's known. Mrs. Alcott looks at her with the small, careful smile of someone who's been holding a secret for a very specific number of years. "Since before you arrived, Miss Wendwood," she says. "We all have." On the 14th of April, the Duke of Linwood does something you may have been waiting for this entire story. He speaks, not to his household, not in the library in the quiet, in a room you need to picture clearly. He speaks at the hearing, in the same room, before some of the same men, in a voice that has not been used in public in 10 years and is, accordingly, a little rough at the edges, like a door that has been kept carefully oiled but never opened. The room smells of old paper and damp wood, and the particular cold of a stone building that has been heated for insufficient time. The men at the front are in their good coats. The men at the sides are standing. Someone near the back coughs once, and the sound is enormous in the stillness. Then it settles. You would feel the quality of that particular quiet. Every man in that room has heard of the Duke of Linwood's silence. Most of them have taken it as a fixed fact of the county, as unremarkable by now as the geology. They're sitting in the presence of someone who has not spoken in public in 10 years, and they are realizing, only in this moment, that they had stopped expecting it to change. You might have stopped expecting it too in their position. He does not speak loudly. He has never, even when he did speak, been a man who needed volume to be heard. When his voice comes, it is careful and deliberate, every word placed with the consideration of someone who has spent a decade deciding exactly which words are worth using. The slight roughness in it, the quality of a voice held private for a very long time, makes the room go quieter than it already was. You can hear the pen of the court recorder. You can hear the fire. He speaks for approximately 12 minutes. You would not find it easy to look away. What he says in substance is this: I was present. I had knowledge. I chose not to speak. I am speaking now. There is a pause after the last sentence. Not a dramatic pause, not performance. The pause of someone who has just done a thing they prepared for 10 years and is allowing the room a moment to understand that it is done. Then he presents the accounts, the original ledgers, the witness statements, the documentation of what Carstone had done and how and when and where the money actually went. It is meticulous. It is precise. It is the work of 10 years in the library, executed without a wasted word. The room receives it in silence. You know this kind of silence, the particular kind that falls when people have just understood something they cannot ununderstand. The magistrates take 3 weeks to deliberate. If you're waiting, 3 weeks feels very slow. In the context of 10 years of preparation, it is nothing. It is the last 3 weeks of a very long wait. On the 7th of May, 1814, the original verdict against Wendwood is formally overturned. The record is amended. The name is restored. 3 words. You can read them in under 5 seconds. It took 12 years. Henrietta receives the news by letter in the library on a morning when the spring light is coming very directly through the tall windows and making the dust in the old leather spines glow in a way that is specific to late mornings in good libraries. If you've ever been in a room like this at exactly this time of day, you know the light I mean. She reads the letter. She reads it again. Then she puts it down, very carefully, on the arm of her chair, the one she has occupied every afternoon for the better part of 2 years, and she presses her hands flat against the paper, and she stays like that for a little while. He is at the desk. He's watching her. He's not pretending to write. She looks up from the paper. He is still at the desk, not moving, as though he's waiting for something. Permission, perhaps, or for her to tell him what the rules are now. She looks at him for a long moment. She looks back at the letter. She reads the last line again. The record is amended. The name is restored. She reads it a 3rd time, in the way you read something when you need to convince yourself it is real. Then she picks up the letter. She holds it. She puts it down very carefully on the arm of her chair. She gets up. She goes to the window. The May light is different from the October light, fuller, less apologetic. The garden below is in full abundance. The formal beds are doing what well-tended English gardens do in early May when they've been carefully kept through a hard winter and have earned the right to bloom extravagantly. She stands at the window. She is not crying. She is something else, something for which there is no word in 1814, and possibly no word in your time either. She is the specific sensation of something returning that you had stopped expecting to return. She hears him cross the room, that measured, deliberate pace. It stops just behind her. She doesn't turn. He doesn't speak. They stand at the window in the May light, with the garden below doing what it always does. Thus he says her name. 1 word. Her name. Just that. Nothing else. She has heard her name spoken in many ways by many people, with contempt, with indifference, with the brisk employer's neutrality of someone being careful around a scandal. She has heard it spoken by Mrs. Alcott with warmth, by her father, a long time ago, with love. She's never heard it spoken like this. She turns around. What happens next is not a scene you need a narrator for. You already know what it means when two people who've been circling the centre of something for 2 years finally stand still at the same time. The garden goes on blooming, the light goes on moving across the floor, the quill rests on the desk. Now you need to understand something about what a verdict reversal actually meant in Regency England, because it is not what you might expect. The social consequences of a criminal conviction in this period were severe and lasting, not just for the convicted but for their family. Henrietta had lived those consequences for 12 years. She had been turned away from positions, declined from lists, refused the benefit of a professional standing she had done nothing to lose. All of that, in theory, reversed when the verdict was overturned. But in theory in 1814 means this: it reverses slowly. Social memory is not a legal document. It cannot be amended by a ruling. What the ruling does is provide the legal foundation from which a reputation can, over time, be rebuilt. The rest takes people deciding, individually, whether to receive you, whether to call, whether to include your name on an invitation. And this is where the Duke of Linwood proves useful in ways that have nothing to do with the law. He begins speaking, not dramatically, not suddenly at full volume in every room, but he begins. He speaks to his steward, to Mrs. Alcott, to the solicitor, who finds this a considerable relief after 10 years of managing conversations the Duke had to conduct in writing. He speaks in the brief, correct, warm way of someone returning to something they were always good at and had simply set aside. In June, he receives a caller, a county lady of some standing. You'd recognise the type, cautious and curious in equal measure, who has decided the situation has clarified enough for a visit. She arrives with a card. She's received. The Duke is present. Henrietta is present. He speaks to the caller with the easy authority of a man who is 34 years old and has spent a decade managing an immaculate estate, and who is not, it turns out, at all uncertain about how to conduct himself in a drawing room. The caller leaves. Her report to the county is favourable. More than that, you'd say enthusiastic if you'd been privy to the conversation over dinner that evening. More callers follow, slowly, carefully, but they come. Henrietta Wendwood, meanwhile, has a name again, a legal name, a restored name, a name that can be written on a calling card without explanation. She has a year's worth of salary saved carefully in a small box in her room. She has a trunk of her father's books, which have lived in the library for 2 years, and are now worn at the spines in the way of books that have been read and reread by someone who loves them. She has 27 pressed flowers in a drawer, each one labelled in a precise economical hand. She has a question she's not yet sure how to ask, and you'd be wrong, by the way, if you assume the question frightened her. The question is a simple one. What happens now? What happens now is not as clear as it might seem. She has a restored name. She has savings. She has, theoretically, options she did not have in January 1813. She could take another position. She could find a room in a respectable town. She could, with the restored verdict and the support of a duke who has begun to speak again, rebuild something like the professional life she might have had if 1802 had gone differently. These are the options. She's aware of them. She considers them with the same methodical care she brings to everything. She does not take any of them. And if you've been paying attention, you know exactly why. Not because she can't, because the question of what she wants, now that wanting things has become possible again, is a different question from the question of what she can do. She has spent 12 years focused entirely on the possible. The wanted is a larger territory, harder to navigate. requiring a different kind of courage than any of the previous 12 years had demanded, and she had found those years considerably demanding. She thinks about the library. She thinks about the notes in the drawer. She thinks about the pressed flowers, the snowdrop in its small glass, the primrose with "yours" on the wrapper. She thinks about the footsteps she has fallen asleep to for 2 years, now no longer above her but across the hall. She thinks about her name, spoken at the window in May light. You know what she decides. Then she does something she's never done in the course of their acquaintance. She initiates the correspondence. She leaves a note on his desk, not about a book, or the law, or the garden, about what she wants. 4 lines. She has thought carefully about what to put in 4 lines. She has been thinking, you might say, since the October morning when she first understood what the relationship between them was becoming. She leaves the note, she goes to her chair, she opens her book, she reads for once with something close to calm. She has done what she could do. The rest is his. The next morning on her breakfast tray there is no note. There is an envelope, a letter, several pages sealed with the L. She reads it with her coat on and her tea going cold. And if you've ever read something you'd been waiting years for without knowing you were waiting, you'll understand the particular quality of that morning. The letter contains 3 things. A formal offer of marriage, written in the correct legal register, which his solicitor will have told him is the proper form. A second section, shorter, in a different voice, his own voice, the one from the notes, explaining that the offer is genuine, that it is not gratitude, that it is not obligation, and that he has been trying to find the right form for the question since approximately March, and has concluded that the right form is simply to ask it directly. And a third section, 4 lines again, that she reads more than the others. I have been writing to you for 2 years. I find that I would like to continue indefinitely. I believe the arrangement I am proposing makes this possible. I am asking, with whatever words I have available, if you will let me. She finishes the letter. She holds it for a moment. She puts it in her pocket with all the others. She goes to the library. She's not surprised to find him at the desk. She crosses the room. She's never done this before, crossed to his desk without being invited. And she puts a note in front of him. 1 line this time. She has kept the remaining 3 lines for later. She's kept them for the rest of the conversation, which is going to take a very long time, and which she is looking forward to. He reads the 1 line. He looks up at her. She's already sitting in her chair. She already has her book open. He reads the 1 line again. And you know, by now, what the sound of the pen picking up means. But it's different now. She knows it's for her. She always suspected. Now she knows. Outside, the June garden is doing its best work of the year. The quill moves. The sun moves. The room is entirely full. What does it mean to build a life on the far side of a very long silence? It depends, if you want the honest answer, on who you are. In Linwood Hall, it means this. The library remains the centre. This is non-negotiable and unspoken. One of the first agreements they reach without reaching it. The way all their agreements are made. They're in the library every afternoon. They've always been. They still are. But other things change. He speaks more, and if you listen carefully you'll notice it's always deliberate. Not with everyone. He's not a man who has ever needed volume to be heard, and 10 years of quiet has refined rather than erased his sense of what's worth saying. But he speaks. To his steward in the morning meetings that have been conducted in writing for a decade and now sometimes have a brief verbal component that surprises the steward into something close to a smile every time. To Mrs. Alcott. To the solicitor. to the occasional caller who arrives at Linwood Hall and discovers that the reclusive Duke is, actually, both pleasant and direct, and has opinions about the drainage board that are clear and firmly held, and to Henrietta, which is, if you've been paying close attention, the most significant change of all. They speak and they write, both. Neither replaces the other. There are still notes on the breakfast tray, fewer, perhaps, but still present. There are still evenings in the library when the only sound is the pen, but there are also mornings in the garden, walking the formal paths together. Something she says makes him stop and respond. Her response makes him stop in turn. They are late to breakfast, which the household has begun accommodating with the tact of people who are very good at their jobs. Marriage in the Regency world was an institution of considerable legal rigidity. Your property transferred to your husband on marriage, your legal identity merged with his, your financial independence ceased in any formal sense. This was the framework Henrietta stepped into in September of 1814, when the marriage was made official in the church at the edge of the estate. You should know that she understood all of this fully. She was a solicitor's daughter. She had been reading legal documents since she was 12 years old. She chose it. Not because the framework was good, she was entirely clear-eyed about the framework, but because the man she was choosing it with had spent 12 years demonstrating, in the most tangible possible way, that he understood what it costs people when those with power fail to use it correctly. And because the specific terms of their arrangement, worked out in writing with input from the solicitor and considerable input from Henrietta, were more equitable than the law required. She kept her own household accounts. She kept the name Wendwood as a middle name in perpetuity, which, if you've been paying attention to what names mean in this world, tells you everything about her priorities. She had the library clearly, without discussion, as her own. These were not concessions. They were simply the arrangement two people reach when they have spent 2 years communicating with scrupulous precision and are not about to stop. What does the arrangement look like in practice? What do you picture when two careful people decide to share a life? It looks like two people reading in the library every afternoon. It looks like morning walks in the formal garden. She has learned to tend it herself in the hours before he wakes, slowly, in consultation with the head gardener, who was initially suspicious and is now entirely on her side. It looks like notes on the breakfast tray. You'd recognize them. Some forms of communication are too good to abandon simply because a more convenient one has become available. In their first autumn together, she begins reading aloud again. Not quietly, not under her breath, not waiting to see if anyone objects. She reads at full volume whatever she's reading in the evenings. He listens the way he always listened. He comments sometimes. The comments are worth hearing. When she finishes, he picks up whatever he's reading and reads a passage back to her. This is the evening. This is most evenings. And if you were to describe it to someone from the outside world, you'd struggle to make it sound as full as it is. She asks him, one October evening, how his voice feels. He considers this for a moment in the way he considers things. Then he says it feels like a tool he'd forgotten how to use well, that he's been practicing. She asks if he thinks he'll get back to what he was. He says he doesn't know. He says he's not sure that's the right question. He says that what he was, at 23, was someone who didn't know what his voice was for. She picks up her book. He picks up his pen. The fire settles. The first autumn of their marriage is, if you're watching from outside, remarkably quiet. This is by design and by temperament. Two people who spent the previous 2 years building something very carefully have no intention of dismantling its structure just because its name has changed. They are in the library every afternoon as they have always been. They walk the formal garden every morning that it doesn't rain. Some mornings that it does. If you watched from an upstairs window, you'd call it a habit of the best kind. They are late to breakfast on Tuesdays with a regularity that Mrs. Alcott has entirely given up remarking on, even internally, having made a private decision that some things in a household are better accepted than explained. In October, Henrietta does something she has been planning since January 1813. She goes through her father's books. They have been in the library since she arrived. The trunk was unpacked at the Duke's direction. The books sit on the lower shelves to the left of the window, where she can reach them from her chair without standing. She has read them. She has reread them. She has been thinking about them in the slow, accumulating way you think about things that belong to someone you loved. It is different from thinking about them in the ordinary way. She goes through them properly now. She takes each one down. She reads the inscriptions. Most of the books have them, written in her father's hand in the front boards, dates and occasions and sometimes a single sentence about why he acquired it. She reads the marginalia. He was a marginal reader. Her father. If you'd open one of his books without knowing who owned it, you'd have known immediately. The hand, the precision, the occasional brief dismissal in 2 words. This was a man who had trained himself to think carefully and expected no less from whatever he read. She finds the one she was looking for on the 3rd day, a small volume of legal essays, published in 1789, with a long inscription on the front board. For Henrietta, who will read this before I've had the chance to annotate it properly, T.W. 1798. She was 10. She remembers being given this book and being delighted by the formality of the inscription, by her initials in ink, by the promise of annotations that hadn't yet arrived. She never did read it. She got as far as the 3rd essay and set it aside for something with a better narrative drive. If you can picture a 10-year-old's patience for legal theory, you'll understand the impulse. She reads it now. It is, as you might expect, both more interesting and more demanding than her 10-year-old self was prepared for. She reads it twice. She puts it on her own shelf separately where she can find it. He notices, not intrusively. He doesn't comment directly, doesn't ask. But one afternoon when she's still working through the trunk, she looks up and finds him watching. She holds up the book she's currently holding. He puts down his pen. He crosses the room, the same measured, deliberate pace, and she hands it to him. He reads the inscription. He reads it again. Then he gives it back. He returns to his desk. That evening, on her dinner tray, there is a note. It contains one sentence. "You should tell me about him, if you'd like to." She writes back the following morning, "I would like to." They talk about her father across November, in notes, in the evenings, in the occasional morning walk when the conversation is quieter and more direct, and the garden is cold enough that their breath shows. She tells him about the office in the market town, the 2 clerks who came in 3 days a week, the particular smell of the fireplace in winter. She tells him about the handwriting, consistent, precise, the kind of hand that announces, if you know what to look for, that the person who owns it was taught carefully and took the teaching seriously. She tells him about the Tuesday evenings. Her father would read aloud from whatever case he was working on, in a simplified version, asking her questions, wanting her to think. She has not told anyone else about the Tuesday evenings. She'd assumed, at some point, that she'd forgotten them. She hadn't. He listens. He asks the particular questions of someone who is genuinely trying to understand a person they will never be able to meet. You'd call it, if you had to name it, a form of care, the specific kind that doesn't announce itself. By December, she feels that he knows something real about her father. Not the legal facts, those he already had. Something else. The shape of a life. You'd know the difference if you'd ever had the experience of someone caring enough to ask. The household, meanwhile, has been watching this autumn unfold, with the collective attention of people who've been waiting 12 years for something to happen in this house that isn't just excellent estate management. Mrs. Alcott has been present at Linwood Hall before the silence began, and through the entirety of it. She is taken to walking the library corridor at approximately the hour when the two of them are most likely to be engaged in conversation, not to listen, not to intrude, simply to confirm that a thing is real. She confirms it, she moves on. And if you've been wondering how a household processes 12 years of silence followed by its sudden end, this is your answer. Quietly, carefully, and with the grace. You know the kind. People who have always managed things with the tact of people who have always been very good at their jobs. Rowley the steward has been in post for 9 years. He has conducted the entirety of his professional relationship with the Duke through a leather-bound correspondence book. His first verbal morning meeting in October of 1814 produces an expression you would recognise if you had ever watched someone recalibrate. Complicated and then quickly composed. He recovers quickly. By November, the verbal component of the morning meetings is unremarkable to him. By December, he and the Duke discuss things the way two men do when they have worked well together for years. They have simply found a more efficient communication channel. She asks Rowley one November morning if she might look at the estate records going back 10 years. He looks at her with the expression of a capable man recalibrating whether a woman he'd assumed was decorative is, in fact, going to require him to think. You'll recognise that expression if you've ever had it aimed at you. She gives him a moment. He goes and fetches the records. She finds 3 things in the records worth knowing. Things you'd find too, if you had her eye for the way numbers say one thing when arranged one way, and something quite different when arranged another. An eye trained on her father's accounts at 13 and never entirely put down. First, the estate in the Northern Valley, rented by the same tenant family for 40 years, has been operating at a loss for 9. Someone, the previous steward she suspects before Rowley, has been accounting for it in a way that obscures this. Second, and worth noting, the drainage project in the Eastern Field was fully costed and approved in 1809, and then simply never commenced. She's heard the Duke mention it to Rowley twice. Both times he said it needed doing. You might ask why nothing was done about it. She doesn't know yet, but she intends to find out. Third, there is a school attached to the estate church, built in 1806. It was funded by the estate for 2 years and then quietly defunded. It now stands empty, and this is the part that matters. No document she can find records this as ever having been put before the Duke. She writes this up in a brief report. She leaves it on the library desk. She goes to her chair. She opens her book. He reads it. The pen stops for longer than usual. Then he picks up the pen and writes, "How long did this take you?" She writes, 3 days. He writes, "The Northern Valley tenant should have a proper conversation about terms. The drainage was fully costed, and the school... I wasn't told about the school." She writes back, "I know. I checked 3 times." He writes back, "The school should be reopened." She writes, "I agree." There is a long pause. If you were in the room, you'd have heard only the fire and the occasional movement of the quill. Then he writes, I'd like you to manage the reopening if you're willing." She considers this for a moment. Then she writes, "I'm willing. I have some ideas about the curriculum." He writes back, "I expected nothing less." By Christmas of 1814, the first Christmas at Linwood Hall that you might describe as warm in more than the literal sense, the library has expanded to include a second writing desk. Smaller, positioned by the window that she has preferred since the first afternoon in January 1813. It is not a dramatic addition. It is not remarked upon. It simply appears one morning with a new chair and a pen tray and a small stack of good writing paper, and is from that point forward hers. She sits at it for the first time and writes a note about it. Not for him, or not only for him. For herself, for the record, in the way you mark something you don't want to forget. She puts the note in the drawer. The Christmas itself is modest. They are not hosting the county in December that will wait until March. Neither of them has much appetite for the kind of celebration that performs itself for witnesses, but there is a tree, at Mrs. Alcott's suggestion, in the entrance hall. There's a properly set table. There are candles, and there is an evening in the library after dinner. He reads to her from a book of poetry he has had since university. The spine has been repaired more than once. He reads in the quiet voice of someone who has said these particular poems so many times, he no longer needs to read them. He merely says them. She listens with her eyes closed. She is not asleep. If you could stand in the doorway of the library at Linwood Hall on Christmas evening 1814, you would see exactly what the last 2 years have been building toward. The fire low, the candles burning, the poetry filling the room, a room that is entirely full, a life that is entirely full. She keeps her eyes closed until he finishes. Then she opens them. "Again?" she says. He turns back to the first page. The winter passes. The spring comes back. It always does, in a way you can rely on more than most things. The snowdrops appear again under the old elm, the same bed that has arrived in January every year for longer than either of them has been alive. She goes to see them on a morning in late January. She stands at the elm in her coat and looks at them for a little while. Then she goes inside. She puts the kettle on. She writes a note about the snowdrops, for no reason except that some things are worth writing down. She leaves it on his desk. He reads it. He writes back, later that morning, "They were early again this year." She writes, "They always are." He writes, "Yes." There are some conversations that don't need more words than this. That is something you understand by now. It is something they understand too. The first formal dinner they host is in March of 1815. This is, if you're keeping count, the first formal social occasion at Linwood Hall in 12 years. The Duke of Linwood has not hosted a dinner in 12 years, and the Duchess of Linwood is the kind of person who is worth talking to. Henrietta wears the title with a slightly wry awareness, given that she spent 12 years being refused positions on the basis of her father's reputation. The county agrees, cautiously at first, then with increasing enthusiasm, in the way that societies decide they have always been open to something once it is clearly happening regardless. If you've ever watched a room recalibrate its position on someone, you know exactly how this goes. There is one particular guest that evening who you might find interesting. A county lawyer of standing, who corners Henrietta between the soup and the fish with a question about the private prosecution system. She does. She has several. She has been thinking about it since October of 1813. Some of those thoughts are written down in a document that sits in the library. She gives him the short version. He listens with the expression of someone revising his expectations upward. He asks if she would be willing to correspond on the matter. She says she would. She does. That correspondence over the following 3 years contributes to a parliamentary debate on the reform of private prosecutions, modestly but not negligibly. Note this, because it matters. Nothing changes immediately. Nothing in Parliament changes immediately. But something has been said, and the saying of it has been heard, and that is how things begin. If you're waiting for a more dramatic conclusion, this is how it usually works. In letters, in careful arguments, in one dinner conversation at a time. Meanwhile, in the library at Linwood Hall, the pressed flowers continue, and you might be glad to know this, given how they started. She has kept every one. All 27 labelled in that precise economical hand, now supplemented with her own notes, a date, a small observation, sometimes simply the word yes. And on the table by her chair in the late evenings, there is a small manuscript, 29 pages, carefully written, revised, written again over the course of a winter. It is a clear account of what happened to Thomas Wendwood, solicitor, in the autumn of 1802. And if you've come this far, you deserve to know it exists. Not a legal document, not a petition, a personal account, written for herself first and then for anyone who might want to know. The first page begins with 5 words. My father was an honest man. She did not find this easy to write. She found it necessary. He reads it when she gives it to him, one December evening. He reads it with the attention of someone reading something that cost the person who wrote it. He reads to the last page. He sits for a while. Then he picks up the pen and writes in the margin of the last page next to the last sentence. I know. I'm sorry. I am glad you are here. 3 sentences. She keeps the manuscript. You would keep it too. Now. Before you go, there are a few things worth understanding about this story. Things that sit a little more comfortably in the light than in the dark. The world Henrietta lived in was not a fair one. You know this partly because the world you live in isn't entirely fair either. The human capacity for recognizing structural unfairness across 2 centuries turns out to be fairly robust. The Regency legal system had enormous capacity to produce the wrong verdict and very limited capacity to correct it. Thomas Wendwood died wrongly convicted. That stays true. No amount of restored verdicts and restored names and happy marriages in well-run libraries can reach back and undo it. What this story offers instead is something different. Not fairness restored, but work continued. Record corrected. Name given back to the people who needed it. Something, if you look at it clearly, you can hold on to even when the larger system remains broken. In the Regency world, the idea that ordinary people, even relatively resourced ones, could affect the legal record over time was not a guaranteed idea. It was a possible one. The difference between possible and guaranteed was mostly persistence, the willingness to keep doing the painstaking, unglamorous, non-narrative work of building a case when no one was watching. 7 years tracking witnesses, 3 years persuading them, 10 years of ledgers and letters and a very specific kind of patience. You've heard what that patience sounds like. It sounds like a pen moving across paper in an otherwise quiet room. Justice, when it comes, is often slower than you'd want and quieter than you'd expect. It is built from materials that don't look, in the moment, like the substance of grand gestures. It is built from notes, from ledgers, from a woman with £12 and a trunk of books who got on a carriage in January and went toward the thing she was afraid of. Because the alternative was worse, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, it is built from someone finally saying the thing they should have said before. There is something else worth knowing before you go. Henrietta Wendwood was not, by the standards of her era, an extraordinary person. This is not a diminishment, it is the point. She was educated to a level that was common in solicitors' families who took education seriously. She had a facility with documents and legal argument that came from practical training, not from unusual gifts. She was patient and determined, and she had a very clear sense of what was true and what wasn't. She was not going to let the second pass as the first, even when the effort required was considerable and nobody particularly cared. Women like Henrietta existed in large numbers in Regency England. They left relatively few records, because the records of Regency England were largely made by and about men. If you go looking for them now, and people do, historians do, what you find tends to be in the margins, in letters not meant to be kept, in household accounts, in the specific texture of what the archive chooses to preserve and what it quietly sets aside. What Henrietta's story offers is, in part, an act of recovery, of saying this, here, this person, this work. This is what the particular weight of a wrongful verdict felt like from the inside, from the family it crushed, from the woman who decided she wasn't going to let it be the end of the record. The manuscript she wrote, the 29 pages beginning "My father was an honest man," is the kind of document that does not transform anything overnight. You might find this frustrating if you've been hoping for a more dramatic pivot, but it is also the kind of document that does not disappear. It exists, and things that exist can be found. Things that exist are recoverable. She knew this. Her father knew it before her. He was a solicitor. He understood the weight of a written record better than most. She carried that understanding forward. She built it into the life she lived, into the school she reopened, into the correspondence she maintained with a county lawyer she met once at a dinner party, and who turned out to be worth writing to for 15 years. None of this is the stuff of drama. You can't really stage it. It does not lend itself to a single scene of triumph, a single moment where the music swells and the verdict changes. It lends itself, instead, to an accumulation of Tuesdays, of letters written and sent, of a manuscript put in a drawer and taken out again and put back again, of two people reading in a warm room, quietly, not needing to announce what they are to each other because they already know. There is a word for this kind of work, several words, depending on which tradition you're borrowing from. The simplest version is steadiness, the willingness to keep going when going is slow, when the results are modest, when no one is watching with the particular attention that makes you feel the effort has been worthwhile. She was steady. He was steady in his own way across the 12 years before her. His steadiness cost him more than she ever let him see. She knew this. She chose not to see it in front of him, out of a respect for privacy. Her father had held the same belief. How you hold your own difficulty is, ultimately, your own affair. They were steady together, which is harder than being steady alone, and rarer. That steadiness is what you've been listening to, the long, slow rhythm of it, the particular quality of a life that doesn't require applause to continue functioning, that keeps its own accounts, that writes its own record and sends it out into the world. No expectation of notice, no need for an audience. You noticed. That's enough. Now, take a breath. You're somewhere comfortable. The world outside is doing whatever it does at this hour, rain on glass maybe, or a particular quality of quiet, or the distant sound of something still moving while you've come to rest. You've been travelling. You've been to a house in the English countryside in 1813. The frost was on the garden. The fire was in the library, the pen was always moving. The house is quiet now. The quill is resting. The garden, in whatever season it's currently keeping, is tended and still. In the library, on the table by the chair that has always been hers, there is a manuscript, a pressed flower, the accumulated correspondence of 2 careful years, and eventually a life. Let your shoulders go. You've been holding them. Whatever it is you're still turning over, the thing that came in with you tonight, you can set it down now. The story is finished. The work is done. The verdict has been read. The record has been amended. The name is restored. In the library at Linwood Hall, the sun is moving across the floor, the way it does in the late afternoons of good libraries. The room is entirely full. You don't have to hold any of this. It'll keep. The history will keep. The story will keep. It's been keeping for 200 years already, and it'll keep a little longer while you rest. The fire is low. The pen is still. Outside, whatever is blooming without your help, in the patient way of things that know how to take care of themselves. You did good, getting here, staying with it. Sleep now. Good night, my friend.